In lesson 2, we'll learn how to authentically express our emotions. And I'd like to start off with a story from one of my students who came to me saying that she had an anger problem. Her husband would come home. She has 2 kids and was working, and her husband would come home and would talk about how hard his day was, and she felt like punching him. And she felt so ashamed that she had so much anger. So she came to me saying, Farah, I have an anger problem and I don't know what to do. And I started to ask some questions and inquire a little bit more about what was happening in her life. And what we discovered is she didn't have an anger problem. She was exhausted from having 2 kids and working and trying to keep everything together. Anger was just the secondary emotion of her tiredness and exhaustion. And I tell you this story because there's so many layers to this. One is that she was constantly swallowing her tiredness, her exhaustion, constantly swallowing her anger until it would explode in mean ways and things that she said to her husband. And then she felt so ashamed of being angry at her husband, of someone she loved dearly. Emotions have an intelligence. And this is one of the first things that's important to understand, because in our culture, we have this outdated idea that some emotions are good and some are bad. We've inherited this from our parents. And often we think that anger is a bad emotion and we shame ourselves for having anger, or we shame ourselves for having fear or frustration. From the perspective of emotional intelligence, emotions are neither good nor bad. They are pleasant or unpleasant at the level of sensation. Anger is an unpleasant emotion that usually causes restriction and heat. We can think of joy as an expansive emotion that really connects us to others, or sadness as an emotion that really has a downward pull, an inward pull. Emotions are neither good nor bad. They have a pleasant or unpleasant physical sensation, and they're often accompanied by a thought. The other myth in our culture around emotions is that emotions are inferior to logic. So we sometimes try to logic ourselves out of our emotions. In fact, emotions are important for our ability to think creatively and use our intuition. The other myth in our culture is that crying is a sign of weakness. Crying is a normal and natural response when we're stressed. In fact, they've done chemical analysis of tears when we have an irritant to the eye versus tears that we cry when we're stressed. And the tears that we cry when we're stressed contain adrenaline and cortisol and important hormones that we are releasing from our body. So crying is not a sign of weakness. It is a very normal and natural response. And understanding emotions and getting beyond this idea of good and bad is fundamental so that when emotions arise, we are not judging and shaming ourselves. Now, as it comes to anger, we can also understand that anger can be a primary emotion or a secondary emotion. Usually, it's a secondary emotion. And what I mean by secondary is it's masking something underneath. And that might be frustration, disappointment, sadness, pain, or some other emotion. That we are so afraid of expressing how we actually feel because it would make us feel vulnerable and we don't want to appear weak, that we build up a barrier and use anger and aggression instead. The intelligence of anger as a primary emotion is that it serves the function to protect what's important. In the case of this working mother who was angry at her husband, it's not that she was angry at her husband, it's that she was exhausted and she didn't know how to be vulnerable and communicate to her partner to say, I need a day off. I can't do this anymore. Would you be willing to help me figure this out so that I can have a day off and we can have someone take care of the kids? That was an entirely different conversation than the kind of conversation she was having. and didn't involve internalizing all this shame that she was swallowing. Emotions come from the Latin word immovere, which mean to move through. They are physical energies that need to move through our bodies, and they often have a mental component, which is why it triggers thoughts of blame and judgment, why it triggers narratives of our own unworthiness or shame. And emotional intelligence involves 5 things. The first is awareness. Awareness of an emotion as it arises. For myself, I know that anger feels hot, and I can feel my temperature rising. And when it gets to a certain point, I know to take a time out so that I'm not communicating in anger. Emotional intelligence involves awareness. It involves self-regulation, knowing how we can calm ourselves down, knowing what we can do to really bring us back into balance. It also involves asking questions, inquiry. What is this all about? Is there a boundary or value that's being violated? Is this related to my past programming or habits from childhood? Asking the questions of why is this emotion coming up? So emotional intelligence involves awareness, it involves self-regulation, it involves inquiry, it involves skillful communication or action, and lastly, it involves empathy of the other person's point of view. So in this module on authentic emotional expression, you've learned that when emotions come up, to take a time out and to really direct your awareness inward, to ask yourself, what's going on? What am I feeling? And then we start to learn how to communicate.